Life is lived on the obsidian edge, where the stakes are high and one wrong move can change your destiny in an instant. Join us for a thrilling ride through the most dangerous and exciting stories of the human heart. Hit subscribe now and stay on the edge with us. My son's wife looked me dead in the eye and said the brooch was just sitting in a drawer, and nobody was using it anyway. That was the moment I understood what the last 18 months had really been. When I called the antique dealer who'd bought it, he said, "Sir, I need you to come in. There's something inside it I think you should see yourself." I had been standing in the hallway outside the guest room, Margaret's sewing room, before they converted it, when I noticed the small dish on the dresser was empty. The porcelain dish she'd kept by the window, the one painted with tiny blue flowers around the rim that she'd found at a market in Stratford years ago. She'd always kept the brooch there when she wasn't wearing it. Not in a jewelry box. Not in a drawer. On that dish, in the light, where she said it looked the way her grandmother would have wanted it to look. I stood there for a moment with my hand resting on the doorframe. The sewing room smelled like my son's wife's perfume now, something sharp and synthetic that didn't belong in that space. Fabric samples and half-finished quilts had been boxed up and pushed to the back of the closet to make room for her work-from-home setup, her monitors and ring light, and the stacks of binders she never seemed to open. I looked at the empty dish and told myself I was probably mistaken. The brooch was somewhere else. I was 63 years old and I misplaced things. I checked the main bedroom first. I opened Margaret's jewelry box on the bureau, the rosewood one her sister had given her for their 30th anniversary trip to Nova Scotia. The brooch wasn't there. I checked both nightstand drawers, then the bathroom cabinet, then the linen closet in the hallway, because sometimes Margaret had tucked things away in odd places, and I still found them now, 18 months after her passing, and those small discoveries still hit me like a door swung open into my chest. The brooch wasn't anywhere. Downstairs, my son was on the sectional with the hockey game on and a bowl of chips balanced on his knee. My daughter-in-law was at the kitchen island with her laptop open and a glass of wine beside it. My grandson was somewhere in the basement. I could hear whatever he was watching through the floor. I said to my son's wife, "Have you seen your great-grandmother's brooch? The cameo one?" It was on the dish in the sewing room. She didn't look up from her screen right away. When she did, her expression was not the expression of someone who didn't know what I was talking about. She said it was just sitting there. She said she'd seen it for months and assumed I wasn't using it. She said she'd taken it to that little antique shop on James Street because they'd needed money for the flights to Tofino and I'd already said no when they asked, so she'd found another way. She said it like that. Found another way. As though raiding my late wife's belongings was a reasonable alternative to not going on vacation. My son unmuted the television and turned up the volume. I stood in my own kitchen and looked at my daughter-in-law and thought about Margaret. I thought about Margaret's grandmother bringing that brooch from Glasgow in 1931, carrying it across an ocean in a coat pocket. I thought about how Margaret had worn it to her parents' funerals, to our wedding, to every Christmas dinner for 36 years of marriage. I thought about how she used to hold it in her palm sometimes when she was sitting quietly, not saying anything, just holding it. I had thought it was a nervous habit. Later I understood it was something else entirely. I went upstairs and closed the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed. The room was very quiet. I picked up my phone and searched antique dealers, James Street, North Hamilton, and found the listing for a shop called Thistledown Antiques and Collectibles. I called. A man answered. His name was Graham. I described the brooch. Oval cameo, carved shell, profile of a woman facing left, set in gold-filled frame, hallmarked on the reverse, probably 1890s Scottish manufacture, a small hairline crack on the lower left of the frame from when Margaret had dropped it on our kitchen tiles in 2008. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he said he needed me to come in, not because there was a problem with the sale, because there was something I should know. I drove to the shop the next morning. It occupied the ground floor of an old brick, the kind of building Hamilton has hundreds of, the kind that used to house hardware stores and insurance offices and now housed coffee shops and vintage dealers. Inside it smelled like cedar and old paper and the particular dusty sweetness of things that had been handled by many hands over many years. Glass cases ran along 3 walls. Maps and prints were hung carefully between the cases. A ship's barometer, a collection of carved decoys, the quiet accumulation of other people's lives. Graham was in his mid-60s, a compact man with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and a careful way of moving through the shop like he knew exactly where everything was, and didn't want to disturb the arrangement. He'd worked on antiques for 40 years. It showed. He brought the brooch out from behind the counter, wrapped in a piece of chamois cloth, and set it gently on a velvet pad. I looked at it and felt the familiar compression in my chest that I'd learned to breathe through. When I was examining the piece, Graham said, I noticed the frame was slightly thicker at the base than is typical for this style. There's a small seam. He indicated it with a wooden toothpick, not touching the metal. It's a hidden compartment. Very fine workmanship. He pressed the base with his thumb. The bottom of the frame released on a tiny hinge, no bigger than the hinge on a doll's furniture. Inside, in the hollow space, was a piece of paper folded to a quarter the size of a postage stamp. I recognized Margaret's handwriting before I could even read the words. That neat, compressed script she'd used for grocery lists and birthday cards, and the notes she used to tuck into my work bag before I drove down to the job site. I used to find them in my coat pockets months later, half dissolved from the wash. The paper said, T.D. Branch, King and Maine. Box 1147. Ask for Diane. I sat in a chair Graham pulled out for me without being asked, and held the brooch and the note, and didn't say anything for a minute. Graham stood quietly behind his counter, giving me the space. He told me he hadn't said anything to the woman who'd brought it in. She'd seemed in a hurry. He'd given her $400 because that was a fair price for the piece without knowing about the compartment. Now that he knew, the piece was worth considerably more. But none of that was what he wanted to tell me. I told him the piece was my late wife's, that her grandmother had brought it from Scotland. Graham nodded as though he'd already suspected this. He said he'd hold it for me as long as I needed. He said the price was whatever I'd be comfortable with. I told him I'd pay the full value, whatever he assessed it at. He said we could talk about that later. I drove 3 blocks before I had to pull into the Tim Hortons parking lot on Barton Street and sit for a few minutes with the engine running. A February in Hamilton. Gray sky, salt-stained pavement, the ordinary grittiness of the city in winter. Inside the car it was warm. I held the brooch in my left hand. Margaret had worn it for 36 years, and I had never noticed the compartment, never thought to look. She had held a secret in her hand every time she wore it, right against her collarbone, and I had loved her and been loved by her, and never known. The T.D. Branch at King and Maine was 10 minutes away. I drove there and parked and went inside and asked for Diane. A woman in her 50s came to the desk, warm and efficient, and I explained I was there about a safety deposit box. I showed her my identification and Margaret's death certificate, which I carried in my wallet because you needed it more often than you'd think. Diane checked her records and told me the box had been opened last in the spring, 3 years before Margaret's diagnosis. The fee had been paid annually, directly from a personal account I hadn't known existed. Diane led me through a door and down a short hallway to a room of stainless steel drawers. She used her key, and mine, the small one from the bottom of the note, which fit perfectly, and withdrew a long, flat box. She set it on a table in a private room and told me to take as much time as I needed. I sat alone with the box for a long while before I opened it. Inside, in a brown envelope sealed with tape, was a bundle of cash, $50 bills, banded together in groups, and beneath the cash, a sealed white envelope with my name on it in Margaret's handwriting. I took the envelope and held it in both hands. The cash could wait. I opened the letter. She wrote the way she talked. Directly, without a lot of preamble, with the slight dryness she'd had when she was saying something that cost her something to say. She wrote that she'd started this account the year our son got married, not because she'd known anything specific would happen, but because she'd paid attention to certain things over the years, and she believed in being prepared. She wrote about a pattern she'd observed. The way her son treated money that wasn't his. The way his wife looked at our house when she thought no one was watching. The way they spoke about the future, our future, meaning theirs, with an ease that had never sat well with her. She wrote that she'd worked extra shifts at the hospital for 6 years to build this, small amounts at a time, nothing that would appear anywhere we'd discuss. She wrote that she was sorry for the secrecy. She wrote that she didn't want to be the kind of wife who hid things from her husband, but she wanted to be the kind of wife who protected her husband, and she decided that in this case those two things couldn't both be true at once. She wrote, "If you're reading this, Arthur, then something has happened that I worried might happen. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know you. I know you will have been patient longer than you should have been, and understanding past the point of understanding, because that's what you do. You find the best explanation for the people you love. I love that about you, but I'm writing to tell you that some people don't deserve that. That love is not the same thing as allowing yourself to be used. You worked for 38 years. This house is yours. Everything in it is yours. The money in this box is yours. Use it for yourself." She had saved $41,000. I sat in that private room at the bank for a long time. Eventually I folded the letter and put it in my inside coat pocket, where I would carry it for months. I put the cash back in the envelope and the envelope back in the box and locked it. I would come back for the money when I knew what I wanted to do with it. Driving home, I thought about everything with a clarity I hadn't had in a year and a half. My son and his wife had been living in my house since Margaret died. They'd arrived for the funeral and stayed. My son had been between jobs. His wife was working from home. They'd said it made sense to stay for a while, to keep me company, to help around the house. I had believed this. I had believed it because I was grieving, and because they were my son and my daughter-in-law, and because I needed to believe that my family was my family. In 18 months, they had not paid a single bill. Not the mortgage, not the utilities, not the property taxes, not the groceries I bought twice a week. My son had started working again by March of last year, but the money had gone to their own spending, their car payments, their streaming subscriptions, the Tofino trip. I had lent my son money 4 times since Margaret died, a total of $11,000 that I had written down in a notebook. Not a dollar had been returned. I had asked them twice to start contributing to household expenses. My son had said, of course, absolutely, as soon as things settled down. His wife had said she thought family didn't operate that way. I had let it go, both times, because I was not someone who pushed. Margaret had tried to tell me that wasn't always a virtue. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car. Through the front window, I could see my daughter-in-law at the island with her laptop, the same position she'd been in that morning. She had not asked me where I'd gone. She had not asked about the brooch since the conversation the night before. I went upstairs and sat at the desk in the corner of the bedroom, the one Margaret had found at an estate sale in Ancaster years ago, the surface scratched and solid. I took a yellow legal pad from the drawer. I wrote the date at the top. Below it I wrote, "What I need to do." I started with documentation. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved through the house systematically. I photographed the condition of each room. The living room couch that my son had broken the middle support on and not mentioned. The scuff marks along the hallway wall from furniture my daughter-in-law had rearranged. The back porch where my son had set up a workbench without asking and left oil stains on the boards I'd laid myself in 2004. I photographed my grandson's bedroom, formerly my office, the walls marked with tape residue from posters. I wasn't angry about any particular item. I was documenting a pattern. I pulled 3 years of bank records and laid them across my desk. Every loan to my son went into a spreadsheet with dates and amounts. Every month of utilities, property tax, insurance, groceries, a total I could not believe until I added it 4 times. Over 18 months of their residence, I had spent or lent an amount that came to just under $37,000, with nothing returned. On the second Friday of February, I drove downtown to the office of a woman named Rachel Okafor. She was a lawyer who specialized in estate and property disputes, and specifically in elder financial exploitation. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building on Main Street West, efficient and book-lined, the kind of office that communicated competence without theatrics. She was in her mid-40s, with a direct manner, and the particular kind of patience that comes from having heard many versions of many stories. I placed my folder on her desk. She went through it methodically, asked sharp, specific questions, made notes. When she was done, she folded her hands and told me clearly where I stood. Under Ontario law, she said, my son and his family were tenants at will. I could establish formal rental terms at any point. If they refused to comply, I had grounds for eviction. The financial documentation I'd brought was consistent with what was defined, legally, as elder financial exploitation. The brooch had been taken and sold without my consent. That was theft. I asked how long eviction would take if contested. She said between 2 and 4 months if they fought it. Less, often, once people understood the documentation existed and that someone serious was behind it. I told her about the safety deposit box, about Margaret's letter. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Your wife was a smart woman." I said, "I know." Her retainer was $2,500. I signed the agreement without hesitating, which surprised me. I had hesitated at everything since Margaret died. I had hesitated to clear her clothes from the closet, to change the password on her email account, to take her name off the car insurance. But I signed this without a pause. My hand was steady. The formal notice went out the first week of March. Rachel had a process server deliver it. My son answered the door. The process server handed him an envelope. I was at the kitchen table, and I could see the hallway from where I sat, and I watched my son's face as he read the first page. He came into the kitchen holding the papers and looked at me like he was waiting for me to say it was a mistake. I told him it wasn't a mistake. His wife came in from the living room. She read over his shoulder. I watched the shift in her expression move from surprise to anger without passing through any intermediate stage. She said I had no right to do this to family. I said the house was mine. She said family didn't charge family. I said I hadn't charged anyone anything for 18 months and that had been my mistake. She said her mother would hear about this. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I said she was welcome to tell whoever she liked. My son looked at me for a long moment. He said he couldn't believe I would do this. He said his mother would be heartbroken. I told him his mother was the reason I was doing it. He didn't know what to make of that. I went back to the bedroom and closed the door. My daughter-in-law launched her campaign the next morning. She called her mother, her sister, 2 of the neighbors, and apparently a cousin who lived in Brampton and had opinions. I heard versions of these calls through the walls and through the ceiling. Over the following days, I noticed that my neighbor on the south side, a retired teacher named Frank, seemed to be avoiding the driveway when my car was there. My son's wife had a gift for narrative, for framing things in terms of her own suffering, and she had apparently put it to use. My son tried a different approach. He came to my bedroom door on the 3rd morning after the notice and knocked and asked if he could come in. I said yes. He sat on the chair by the window, the chair Margaret had used for reading. He was 41 years old, and he looked tired and more genuine than he had in months. He said he knew things had gotten out of hand. He said he hadn't been thinking clearly since his mother died. He said grief did strange things to people. He said he was sorry about the brooch, that he hadn't known his wife had taken it, which I did not believe but did not contest. He said he wanted to make things right. I asked him what making things right meant to him. He said he'd start paying rent, start contributing to groceries, start being the son he should have been. His voice had a quality I recognized from when he was young, a kind of performance of sincerity that he'd used when he was in trouble and wanted things to return to normal without the normal actually changing. I told him I appreciated what he was saying. I told him the notice stood. He said I was being cruel. I told him I was being clear, which I hadn't been for 18 months, and that was the kindness I actually had to offer him now. After he left, I sat at Margaret's desk and reread her letter. I touched the brooch where it sat on the desk beside the rosewood jewelry box. Graham had let me have it back for the price he'd paid for it, $400, and I had tried to give him more and he had refused. I'd told him about the compartment. He'd said he'd wondered about it. He said things like that turned up sometimes, in old pieces, in houses that had been in families for generations. He said people used to be practical about hiding things from people who might take them. I thought about Margaret's grandmother carrying the brooch from Glasgow on a ship, and I thought about Margaret carrying it for 36 years without ever telling me what was inside it. And I thought that the women in that family had a long history of protecting what they loved in ways that weren't obvious until they needed to be. The hearing was scheduled for April. In the weeks before it, my son's wife escalated in ways I documented carefully because Rachel had told me to document everything. She went through my mail. Not regularly enough to take everything, but twice I found opened envelopes refolded and left on the kitchen counter, including one from Rachel's office. I photographed both. Rachel said mail interference was a serious matter and noted it. My son blocked my path in the hallway twice in 1 week, not aggressively enough that I couldn't get past, but enough that it was deliberate, enough to establish something. Both times were captured on the camera I'd installed in the living room corner. It looked like a smoke detector and operated like one too, but the wide-angle lens caught the hallway entrance clearly. The second time, my son put his hand on my shoulder and steered me backward 1 step. He said it was an accident. The camera said otherwise. I emailed Rachel the clip that evening. She responded within the hour and asked if I was safe. I said yes. She said it changes the timeline. File a police report. I drove to the nearest OPP detachment the next morning and filed it. The officer was about 35, professionally neutral, and took the report carefully. I showed her the clip on my phone. She watched it twice. She said she was noting it as a domestic incident, and that if anything further occurred, I should call immediately. Rachel filed for an emergency hearing. She cited the physical intimidation, the male interference, the documented financial exploitation, Margaret's letter, and the contents of the safety deposit box. Within 10 days, we had a date. I drove to the courthouse on a Tuesday in April. Gray sky, rain starting as I parked. Rachel was waiting in the hall outside the courtroom. She wore a dark blazer and carried those folders and had the expression of someone who was entirely comfortable in this building. My son and his wife were at the far end of the hall, with a lawyer whose suit was slightly too large for him. My son looked at the floor when he saw me. My daughter-in-law looked at the ceiling. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, gray-framed glasses, a manner that was precise and completely without interest in delay. She reviewed the submitted materials. She watched the clip of my son pushing me. She read sections of Margaret's letter, which Rachel had included as evidence of a pre-existing pattern of financial predation. She read the financial spreadsheet. She asked my son's lawyer if his clients disputed any of the documented loans. The lawyer said they considered the money to have been gifts. The judge asked if there were any written agreements to that effect. There were not. She asked if there was any documentation of the arrangement regarding household expenses. There was not. She asked if there was any documentation of the arrangement regarding tenancy. There was not. She said the evidence presented was consistent with a pattern of financial exploitation of an elder, and that the physical incident, regardless of how any party characterized it, was documented and corroborated. She issued a restraining order requiring my son to maintain a distance of 3 meters from me within the shared residence. She scheduled a full eviction hearing for 6 weeks out and noted that based on what she'd seen, she expected the outcome to be straightforward. My son's lawyer tried to speak. The judge said she had heard enough for today. Outside, in the hall, my son came toward me. He stopped the required distance away. He said, "Dad, please." He said, "Where are we supposed to go?" His voice had the quality of someone finally confronted with the reality they've been performing their way around. I said I'd given him 18 months. I said I'd given him his whole life, actually, and the accounting on that was not something I was interested in doing. I said Rachel would send the formal timeline. He looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his face that might have been genuine, a flicker of something underneath the self-pity. I thought about the boy he'd been at 10 years old, helping me build the deck on the back porch, asking questions about joinery, genuinely interested, genuinely present. I didn't know when that had changed or why, or whether anything I'd done had been part of it. I thought about Margaret's letter. I thought about the word she'd used, pattern. I nodded at him. That was all I had. I walked out into the rain. Rachel called me the night before the eviction hearing to say she didn't think we'd need to use much of our time. The documentation was substantial. She said I should be prepared for it to be emotional. I told her I'd been emotional for 18 months, and I thought I'd largely worked through the acute phase. The full hearing was an hour. The judge reviewed everything. My son's lawyer made an argument about extenuating family circumstances and the informal nature of the arrangement and the genuine distress his clients were experiencing. The judge listened to all of it. Then she looked at my son and his wife and said that the law did not distinguish between informal and formal arrangements when one party could clearly demonstrate ownership and the other could demonstrate no legal claim. She said the documented financial exploitation and the physical incident substantially reduced whatever sympathy the court might otherwise have extended. She said she was granting the eviction, 60 days. My daughter-in-law began crying. My son sat very still. I felt something settle in me when the judge spoke. Not triumph, settlement, like a load-bearing wall being confirmed as solid. I made 2 decisions in the weeks after the hearing. The first was to sell the house. I told Rachel during a call. She said it was a significant decision and asked if I was certain. I told her that the house had been mine and Margaret's, and that now it was mine alone, and that the next thing it should be was someone else's entirely. I said I was 63, and the house had 4 bedrooms, and I had been rattling around in it alone for a year before my son arrived, and selling it while my son and his wife were still fighting the eviction was the most efficient way to remove the thing they were fighting over. Rachel said, "Strategically, it's very clean, and personally, it sounds like the right call." I listed with a woman named Sandra, who'd sold 2 houses on my street and knew the Hamilton market in the way that only comes from decades of attention. She assessed the house at just under $700,000, which surprised me until I remembered what had happened to the city in the years since Margaret and I had bought it. Sandra said with some cosmetic updates we'd be comfortable at that number. I said I'd like to list this week if possible. My son's wife walked into the kitchen while Sandra was measuring the living room and said, "What is going on?" I said I was selling the house. She looked at Sandra, and then at me, and then at Sandra again. She said I couldn't do that. I said the deed was in my name, and I could. She sat down at the kitchen island and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Where do you expect us to go?" I told her that was something she and my son should have been thinking about 18 months ago. The listing went up on a Wednesday. I had my first offer by the following Monday. A couple in their early 30s, teachers both of them, who walked through the house with a kind of reverence that Margaret would have appreciated. They were pre-approved and wanted a 60-day close, which aligned perfectly with the eviction timeline. I accepted their offer. My son tried twice in the last weeks before they left to have what he called a real conversation. The first time I listened for 10 minutes and then said I had to be somewhere. The second time I told him clearly that I loved him and that what I was doing was not the opposite of love, and that if he wanted a relationship with me after he was settled elsewhere, I was not closing that door, but the door to this house was closed, and no amount of conversation would change that, and the kindest thing I could do was be direct about it rather than let him continue to believe that the right argument would change the outcome. He left me alone after that. The moving truck came on a Saturday in June. Gray again. Hamilton does a lot of gray, which I've always found honest about it. And I stayed in my bedroom until the sounds of boxes and furniture and my daughter-in-law's sharp instructions had moved out to the truck and the truck had gone. Then I walked through the house. They had not been careful. Gouges in the hardwood from the sectional being dragged. A fist-sized dent in the drywall of the guest room that I noted in the photo log with a flat feeling that was not quite anger and not quite vindication. A water ring on Margaret's desk that I touched with my finger and then stopped touching. I photographed everything, narrated the date and time into my phone. I wasn't going to pursue damages. I had won. But the documentation felt like something I owed to accuracy, which is something Margaret had always cared about. I sold the last of the furniture that I wasn't taking with me to a woman who ran a vintage shop on Lock Street. I took Margaret's rosewood jewelry box and her books and her sewing things that I'd put back in the guest room the day my son and his wife left. I took the tools from the garage and the rocking chair from the porch and the photographs from the stairwell. The rest went. Closing day was a Tuesday in July. I signed the papers across a conference table from the young couple, whose names were Daniel and Kate. Kate had a small notebook where she'd written questions and had checked off most of them by the time we were done. Before we shook hands, she said, "We know a little about what this house has meant. We want you to know we'll take care of it." I said I knew they would. I said that was enough. I drove north on Highway 8 to Waterloo, where I'd put down a deposit on a condo in a quiet building near Uptown. Second floor, 2 bedrooms, the second of which would be a workshop. I'd been specific about that when I viewed the units. Told the building manager I was a retired shop teacher who did woodworking and asked whether power tools were permitted with noise management protocols. He'd said yes, with reasonable hours. I'd said that was all I needed. The condo was 20 minutes from where my old colleague Bill lived, a friend from 30 years of teaching at the same school, a man who had stood at the back of the church at Margaret's funeral and handed me a handkerchief without saying anything because he knew there was nothing to say. I'd called him in February, the week after I'd been to the bank, and he'd come over for dinner, and we'd talked for 4 hours about Margaret, and about my son, and about the house, and about what came next. And at the end of it, he'd said, "Well, you know what you're doing. You've always known." I'd said, "I wasn't sure I had." He'd said, "You're sure enough." The first week in the condo, I unpacked in order of importance. Margaret's things first. The jewelry box on the bureau, the rocking chair by the window, her books on the shelves in the living room, organized the way she'd had them, for not alphabetical, but by some private logic I'd never been able to reverse engineer and had given up trying to, and now found comforting in its persistence. The brooch in its dish on the windowsill. Then my tools. I spent a weekend setting up the workshop. Pegboard on one wall, tools hung in their places. The workbench I'd built myself in 1997, which I'd had moved rather than leave it. The table saw I'd bought when Daniel and Kate's money came through. The smell of wood and machine oil and clean sawdust. I tested the table saw on a piece of scrap pine, and the sound of it filled the room and bounced back off the concrete walls and felt like the most uncomplicated thing I'd experienced in 2 years. My son called 6 times in the first month after the sale. I watched the calls come in and did not answer. His wife texted twice. I read the texts and did not respond. My grandson, who was 17 and had been a bystander to most of this, texted once to say he was sorry about everything and that he loved me. I called him back immediately. We talked for 40 minutes. I told him none of this was anything to do with him. He said he knew, but it still felt weird. I said that was fair. I changed my phone number and gave it to Bill, my doctor, the building manager, and my grandson. No one else. Rachel sent a final accounting in August. Everything concluded. The restraining order had expired without incident. Jennifer had made one attempt to file for a guardianship assessment, claiming I was not mentally competent to manage my own affairs, and the family court had dismissed it after a routine interview with my physician, who had sent back a letter that Rachel described as blunt and persuasive. I was 63, in good health, sharper than I'd been in years, if anything, and the suggestion that I was incompetent was, as my doctor put it, not supported by any evidence whatsoever, and appeared to be motivated by interests unrelated to my welfare. I updated my will in September. I sat in Rachel's office and signed new documents. Everything went to 3 organizations: a hospice fund named for a nurse Margaret had admired, a scholarship at the high school where I'd taught, and a community woodworking program for adults that ran out of a church basement in Guelph and did genuinely good work. My son was excluded explicitly, with a line of plain language explaining that he had received substantial financial support during my lifetime and had conducted himself in ways that made further bequest inappropriate. Rachel asked if I was at peace with that. I thought about it for a moment. I said peace was a strong word, but clarity was closer, and yes, I was. On a Saturday in October, the 1-year anniversary of Margaret's diagnosis 3 years ago, I got up before light and made coffee in my small kitchen and stood at the window, watching the sun come up over the university buildings to the east. The sky was that specific Waterloo October color, the one that is not quite orange and not quite gold, and stays for only about 20 minutes before the day becomes ordinary. I stood there until it was done. I took the brooch from the dish on the windowsill and held it in my palm. I'd made a case for it in the workshop over the summer, mahogany with a glass front and a small brass hook inside, fitted to hold the brooch at exactly the angle the light caught it best. It hung on the living room wall beside Margaret's photograph. I put the brooch back and touched the edge of the case lightly. I said, "I found it, Maggie. Everything you left me." I said, "I'm sorry it took me so long." I thought I could hear her voice, the particular dryness she brought to affection. She would have said, "You got there, and that is the thing that counts." I drove over to Bill's house at 10. He had the chessboard set up at the kitchen table. His wife made tea and then left us to it, which was her courtesy. We played for 2 hours. He beat me twice, and I beat him once, and both times I beat him, he accused me of hustling, and I told him I was just paying attention. Driving home, I thought about what Margaret had written, that some people don't deserve the best explanation you can make for them. That love is not the same as allowing yourself to be used. I thought I'd understood those sentences the first time I read them, but I'd understood them better every month since, the way you understand certain things. only by moving through time with them. My workshop was where I went in the evenings. There was always something in progress on the bench. I was making a cabinet for the bedroom, oak with small inlaid panels, a detail work that required patience and a fine chisel and the specific kind of concentration that clears everything else. I'd been a shop teacher for 38 years, and I knew the particular satisfaction of a joint cut cleanly, of a surface planed smooth, of a piece of wood becoming a thing that would outlast you. I'd taught it to hundreds of students, and a few of them had understood it, and one or two had loved it the way I loved it. I thought teaching was like that, mostly transmission, sometimes transformation. I swept the sawdust from the bench and hung my tools back on their pegs and turned off the shop light. In the living room, the brooch caught the lamplight the way it always caught every light, the way carved shell does, that particular warmth that is not quite gold and not quite cream. I stood and looked at it for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen and made dinner for one, which was exactly the right amount.